If you breathe too loudly near the billionaires, I'll make sure you spend the next month sleeping in the basement with your rotting canvases." Bethany Adams didn't even look at her husband as she hissed the words. She was too busy adjusting the diamond necklace that cost more than Peter had earned in his entire life. To her, Peter wasn't a man. He was a piece of faulty equipment she had to hide from the public. The Sheldon Grand Gallery was a cathedral of glass and gold. Tonight, it was filled with the most powerful people in the country. They were here for the prodigy, the woman who had supposedly single-handedly revived the techniques of the Renaissance. Bethany stood in a pool of light, her red silk gown flowing like spilled wine. She looked like a goddess. Peter Adams stood 2 feet behind her, carrying a stack of heavy catalogs. He was wearing a tuxedo he had found at a thrift store. The sleeves were too short, revealing wrists stained with the permanent indigo of a master's pigment. He looked like a stray dog that had accidentally wandered into a palace. "Peter, you're hovering," Bethany snapped, turning her head just enough to flash a fake smile for a passing photographer. "Take those catalogs to the back, and for God's sake, wipe that look of confusion off your face. You look like a peasant staring at a light bulb for the first time." "The Morning Star painting," Peter whispered, his voice dry. "The humidity in this room is too high, Bethany. The glaze on the 3rd layer hasn't fully cured. If the lights stay at this intensity, the canvas will begin to—" "Shut your mouth," she whispered back, her voice vibrating with venom. "You are a janitor who knows how to mix colors. I am the artist. I am the genius the Sheldon family is here to see. You don't tell me about canvas. You don't tell me about art. You go to the service entrance and wait for the crates to be loaded. If I see you in this room when the Empress arrives, I will divorce you and leave you to starve in the gutter where I found you. Before we continue, I want to hear your thoughts. Will Peter finally claim his throne, or will Bethany find a way to silence the master once and for all? Comment justice and tell us which city you are watching from so we can see how far this story has reached." She pushed him. It wasn't a violent shove, but it was enough to make him stumble. A few catalogs slid from his hands and hit the marble floor with a series of dull thuds. A group of wealthy investors nearby chuckled into their crystal glasses. "Is that your new porter, Bethany?" one of them asked, peering at Peter through a gold-rimmed monocle. "He seems a bit clumsy." Bethany let out a melodic, practiced laugh. "Oh, him. He's just a distant relative I took in out of charity. He's a bit slow, poor thing. He helps with the heavy lifting in the studio. Peter, pick those up and get out. Now." Peter knelt on the cold marble. He gathered the books while the elite of the city stepped over his fingers as if he were part of the floor. He felt the weight of 10 years of silence pressing down on his lungs. He was the man who had breathed life into every masterpiece in this room, yet he wasn't even allowed to stand in their light. He turned to leave through the service door, his head bowed. But then, the main entrance of the gallery didn't just open. It was thrown wide. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The chatter died instantly. Serafina Sheldon had arrived. She was the Empress of the capital. She didn't just buy art, she decided what history would remember. She walked with a rhythmic, lethal grace, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk looking for a very specific prey. Bethany's face lit up. She practically sprinted forward, her hand extended. "Miss Sheldon, I am Bethany Adams. It is the dream of my life to show you my—" Serafina didn't even blink. She didn't slow down. She walked past Bethany's outstretched hand as if the woman were made of glass. The Empress walked straight toward the service door. She walked straight toward the man in the frayed tuxedo. Before Peter could take a step into the shadows, Serafina reached out and caught his arm. Then, in front of the most powerful people in the world, she did something that made Bethany's heart stop. She bowed. "Master Peter," Serafina said, her voice echoing through the silent hall, "the world has been a graveyard without your brush. Why are you carrying books for this thief, master? You're calling this man a master? He's a failed student who can't even hold a conversation, let alone a brush." Bethany's scream tore through the prestigious silence of the Sheldon Gallery. Her face, usually a mask of porcelain perfection, was contorted with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She lunged forward, trying to grab Serafina's arm, but 2 of the Empress's silent security detail stepped into her path like stone pillars. Serafina Sheldon stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on Peter with a reverence that felt like a hot iron against his skin. "Bethany Adams," Serafina said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, frozen steel. "You have spent a decade selling the soul of a genius under your own name. Did you truly think a master's hand could be hidden forever?" Peter stood paralyzed. The catalogs he had gathered were still clutched in his indigo-stained hands. For a moment, the gallery vanished. The smell of expensive lilies was replaced by the suffocating scent of linseed oil and damp stone. The memory of the basement flooded back like a drowning tide. 10 years ago, Peter was the ghost of Florence. He was a man who lived for the canvas, a man who could look at a blank wall and see the secrets of the Renaissance. But he was naive. He was a man of art, not a man of the world. When he met Bethany, she saw a gold mine. She didn't see a husband. She saw a product. "The light in the world is too harsh for you, Peter," she had told him on their wedding night. She had led him down the narrow stairs to the windowless basement of their first house. "Stay here. Paint. I will deal with the critics. I will deal with the buyers. I will be your shield." She wasn't his shield. She was his jailer for 30,650 days. Peter Adams lived in that basement. Bethany would bring him bread, water, and the finest paints money could buy, the only thing she didn't skimp on because they were the tools of her fortune. Every morning she would come down, look at his latest work, and scoff. "It's flat, Peter. It's technical, but it has no heart," she would lie, her eyes widening at the masterpiece before her. "I'll sign it and try to sell it for a few $100s. We have bills to pay. You're lucky I'm willing to put my reputation on the line for this garbage." He would watch as she took a thick brush and scrawled B. Adams over his delicate hidden signature. She lived in the sun. She traveled to Paris, London, and New York. She sat at the tables of kings. And when she came home, she would step into the basement, kick his brushes aside, and remind him that he was nothing without her. "You're a freak, Peter. You're mentally broken," she would whisper when he asked to go outside. "If you leave this room, the police will arrest you for forgery. I'm the only one who keeps you safe." Back in the gallery, the present crashed back into him. Peter looked at Bethany. For the first time, he didn't see the protector he had relied on. He saw the woman who had stolen 10 years of his life. He saw the thief who was wearing a necklace bought with the blood of his fingertips. "Master Peter," Serafina said, stepping closer. 10 years ago, the Madonna of the Shadows was sold in the Capitol. The world thought it was a Bethany Adams original, but the restoration team found a mark that only one man in history uses. The sign of the void. Serafina reached out and gently turned Peter's hand over. There, on the side of his thumb, was a permanent callus shaped exactly like a small crescent moon, the result of a unique way of gripping a palette knife that Peter had developed as a boy. "The signature on the front says Bethany," Serafina told the stunned crowd. "But the hand that painted it belongs to the man you've been treating like a servant." Bethany began to shake. "It's a lie. He's a stalker. He's obsessed with me. He's been trying to claim my work for years." "Then prove it, Bethany." A new voice rang out from the back of the room. A tall, sharp-featured woman in a sleek black suit stepped forward. Catherine Singelow, the daughter of a rival gallery owner, and the woman who had been Peter's only friend in the academy before he vanished. Catherine held up a small, high-intensity UV light. "If you painted the morning star, Bethany, you'll know exactly where the hidden watermark is. But if Peter did, he'll know the secret message written in the underglaze." Bethany's face went from pale to ghostly. "Catherine, this is a private auction. You weren't invited." Catherine didn't stop until she was inches from the morning star painting. "I don't need an invitation to a crime scene, Bethany," Catherine said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the signature on the canvas. 10 years ago, my father helped push Peter Adams into the shadows because he was afraid of his talent. I spent a decade believing my father was right. But then, I started looking at your paintings, and I saw a soul that didn't match the woman standing in front of them." Catherine turned to Peter, her expression softening with a mixture of guilt and awe. "Peter, do you remember what you taught me at the academy? About the way a soul leaves a signature that no brush can mimic?" Peter nodded slowly, his voice finding a resonance it hadn't held in years. "The pigments are layered in a crosshatch of lead white and ultramarine. Under a 365 nanometers frequency, the third layer of glaze will reveal the true name of the creator. I wrote it in the bone ash of the underpaint, using a needlepoint brush." "Liars, you're all conspirators," Bethany shrieked, her voice reaching a frantic, ugly pitch. "Security, destroy that scanner. They're trying to hack my intellectual property." But the Sheldon guards remained as still as stone statues. Serafina Sheldon nodded once to Catherine, and the critic clicked the scanner into life. A beam of intense violet light hit the canvas. The crowd leaned in, their breaths held in a collective suspension of time. At first, nothing happened. Then, the bold B. Adams signature at the bottom right began to glow, not with the brilliance of art, but with a muddy, fluorescent yellow. It looked like a dirty scar grafted onto the work. "Look at the glow," Catherine announced to the room, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. The signature was added months after the painting was completed. "It's an external graft. It doesn't belong to the soul of the work." Then Catherine moved the light to the center of the painting, right where the morning sun was depicted hitting the water. Under the UV light, the pigments seemed to rearrange themselves. The bone ash in the underglaze began to shimmer, forming delicate, cursive letters that were woven into the very texture of the waves. It didn't say Bethany. It said Peter Adams, prisoner of the void. The room exploded into a roar of disbelief. Billionaires stood up from their velvet chairs, their faces twisted in shock as they realized they had spent millions on stolen dreams. Prisoner? Serafina Sheldon turned her icy gaze toward Bethany, who had fallen to her knees. You didn't just steal his work, Bethany. You held a master captive. You turned the greatest talent of our generation into a ghost while you lived like a queen. Bethany looked up, her eyes wide and bloodshot. I did it for him. He's sick. He can't handle the world. I was protecting the man I married. Peter stepped forward, and for the first time in a decade, he stood taller than the woman who had caged him. He reached out and snatched the diamond necklace from her throat, the one he knew had been purchased with the sale of his Winter in Florence piece. You weren't protecting me, Bethany, Peter said, his voice cold and final. You were harvesting me. Every diamond you wear is a day of my life you stole in that basement. He turned to Serafina, his eyes burning with a new, dangerous clarity. The Morning Star isn't for sale. Nothing I have painted in the last 10 years belongs to this woman or this gallery. It belongs to the light she tried to extinguish. Bethany let out a hollow, terrifying laugh that sent a shiver through the gathered crowd. She didn't look like a disgraced queen anymore. She looked like a cornered predator ready to tear down the world before she let it conquer her. She slowly stood up, brushing the marble dust from a red silk gown, and reached into the small, beaded clutch she had dropped on the floor. Her hand emerged trembling, but not with fear. It was the tremor of a woman holding her final, lethal trump card. You think a few hidden letters on a canvas are enough to break me? Bethany spat, her eyes darting from Peter to Serafina. You think the law cares about the soul of a painting? Peter, you've spent 10 years telling me how much you struggle with reality. You've spent 10 years taking the medication I provided to keep your visions under control. Did you really think I didn't prepare for the day you finally snapped? She pulled a thick, official-looking document from her bag, the seal of the Riverton Psychiatric Board gleaming under the gallery lights. The room went silent as Bethany held the paper aloft. Bethany looked up, her eyes wide and bloodshot. I did it for him. He's sick. He can't handle the world. I was protecting the man I married. Peter stepped forward, and for the first time in a decade, he stood taller than the woman who had caged him. He reached out and snatched the diamond necklace from her throat, the one he knew had been purchased with the sale of his Winter in Florence piece. You weren't protecting me, Bethany, Peter said, his voice cold and final. You were harvesting me. Every diamond you wear is a day of my life you stole in that basement. He turned to Serafina, his eyes burning with a new, dangerous clarity. The Morning Star isn't for sale. Nothing I have painted in the last 10 years belongs to this woman or this gallery. It belongs to the light she tried to extinguish. Bethany let out a hollow, terrifying laugh that sent a shiver through the gathered crowd. She didn't look like a disgraced queen anymore. She looked like a cornered predator ready to tear down the world before she let it conquer her. She slowly stood up, brushing the marble dust from a red silk gown, and reached into the small, beaded clutch she had dropped on the floor. Her hand emerged trembling, but not with fear. It was the tremor of a woman holding her final, lethal trump card. You think a few hidden letters on a canvas are enough to break me? Bethany spat, her eyes darting from Peter to Serafina. You think the law cares about the soul of a painting? Peter, you've spent 10 years telling me how much you struggle with reality. You've spent 10 years taking the medication I provided to keep your visions under control. Did you really think I didn't prepare for the day you finally snapped? She pulled a thick, official-looking document from her bag, the seal of the Riverton Psychiatric Board gleaming under the gallery lights. The room went silent as Bethany held the paper aloft. This is a court-ordered emergency commitment warrant, she announced, her voice regaining its sharp, manipulative edge. It's signed by 3 board-certified physicians. It states that Peter Adams suffers from severe paranoid schizophrenia and delusional grandeur. It notes that he believes he is the sole creator of the world's most famous art pieces as a symptom of his break from reality. This warrant gives me, as his legal guardian and wife, the power to have him forcibly removed for his own safety and the safety of the public. Peter felt the air leave his lungs. He looked at the document, then at the 2 men in dark suits who had suddenly appeared at the back of the room. Men Bethany had clearly kept on standby, not as bodyguards but as orderlies. The medication she had given him for anxiety all those years. He realized with a sickening jolt that she hadn't been treating him. She had been building a medical record of his instability. Every time he had complained about the basement, every time he had begged to see the sun, she had logged it as a manic episode. Master Peter is a danger to himself, Bethany said, turning to Serafina with a mask of mock tragedy. "He needs help, Miss Sheldon. This Empress's narrative you've spun has only pushed him further into his delusions. Gentlemen, please take my husband to the transport. He needs to be sedated immediately." The orderlies moved forward, their footsteps heavy and purposeful on the marble. The crowd shifted, eyes widening in horror, but no one dared move against a legal warrant. Even Serafina Sheldon's brow furrowed, her lips thinning as she realized the legal trap Bethany had laid. One moment, a voice commanded, booming with an authority that stopped the orderlies in their tracks. It was Catherine Signello again, but she wasn't looking at the painting anymore. She was looking at her phone, her thumbs scrolling rapidly through a high-level database. "Bethany, you forgot that my father didn't just blacklist Peter, he owned the very hospital you used to certify these records. And I just received an encrypted message from the chief of medicine." Catherine stepped forward, her eyes flashing with triumph. "The doctors who signed that warrant? They were struck from the medical register 4 hours ago for taking bribes. Their evaluations of Peter Adams have been flagged as fraudulent by the High Court." Bethany's hand began to shake so violently the paper rattled like dry bone. That's impossible. I have the signatures." Catherine laughed, a cold and beautiful sound. "You have the signatures of criminals. And because you attempted to use a fraudulent warrant to kidnap a citizen in front of the Empress of the capital, you've committed a felony in a room full of federal witnesses." Peter looked at his wife, seeing the shadow of the basement finally lifting from his mind. He didn't wait for the orderlies. He walked past them, toward the burner phone Serafina's guard was holding out to him. "It's over, Bethany. The master isn't going to the asylum. But you're going to a cage with no canvas and no name." Peter took the phone with a steady hand, his fingers no longer trembling with the phantom chill of the basement. He didn't look at the screen. He knew the sequence of numbers by heart, a digital kill switch he had programmed into the Sheldon family's private banking mainframe years ago when he was still an advisor in the shadows. With a single, deliberate press of the enter key, he initiated the blackout protocol. Across the room, the large digital displays meant to track the evening's auction bids suddenly flickered, turning a deep, warning red before plunging into total darkness. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the frantic chirping of smartphones as every billionaire in the room received a simultaneous alert. "Her accounts are hollowed, and her name is a stain that the history books will scrub clean by dawn." She paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the morning star still glowing under the UV light. "But there is a discrepancy. My analysts have been tracking Bethany's sales for years. The numbers don't add up. She was living far beyond even the millions your paintings brought in. There is a secondary flow of capital, black market auctions, private buyers who deal in blood, not just ink." Peter's gaze hardened. He looked at his hands, the indigo stains under his fingernails acting as a map of his captivity. "She wasn't just selling my work," he whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "She was selling the process. In the basement, there was a safe. She told me it was for the insurance papers of the house, but she never let me near it. Every time I finished a major piece, she would take the preliminary sketches, the blueprints of the master's technique, and lock them away. She wasn't just selling art, she was selling the secrets of how to forge the past." Catherine Signello joined them, her face etched with a newfound urgency. "If those sketches get into the wrong hands, Peter, the entire art market collapses. If someone can replicate your void brush technique perfectly, every museum in the world becomes a hall of doubt. We have to get to that safe before her associates realize the blackout protocol has been triggered. If she has partners in the capital, they'll be moving toward your house right now to erase the evidence." The sense of triumph that had filled the room only moments ago vanished, replaced by a cold, racing adrenaline. Peter realized that his freedom was only half won. The basement wasn't just where he had lived, it was the site of a much larger crime against history. He turned to Serafina, his voice no longer that of a victim, but of a man reclaiming his command. "My house is on the edge of the Riverton Heights. It's guarded by a private firm Bethany hired, men who don't ask questions as long as the check's clear. If we're going to stop the leak, we need to move now." Serafina didn't hesitate. She looked over her shoulder at her lead tactician and gave a sharp downward nod. "Prepare the convoy. We are going to the Adams residence, and tell the pilots to have the Sheldon heavy lift on standby." She turned back to Peter, a predatory smile touching her lips. "You spent 10 years in the dark, Master. It's time you saw what happens when the Sheldon family goes to war for one of their own." Peter didn't wait for her to finish. He strode toward the exit, leaving the billionaires and the champagne behind, his mind already miles away back in the windowless room where the final, most dangerous secret of his marriage was waiting to be unmasked. The convoy of black SUVs tore through the rain-slicked streets of Riverton, their sirens silent, but their speed a clear declaration of emergency. Inside the lead vehicle, Peter sat between Serafina and Catherine, the leather seats a stark contrast to the wooden stool he'd occupied for a decade. He watched the city lights blur past, feeling like a diver surfacing too quickly from the depths. The world was too fast, too bright, but he couldn't afford to blink. "The security firm at your house is Shield Point," Serafina said, her eyes fixed on a tactical tablet. "They are mercenaries, Peter. Bethany paid them double the market rate to ensure no one entered and no one left. Since I've frozen her accounts, their loyalty is currently a void. They will either flee or they will try to loot the safe themselves before they vanish." As the convoy turned onto the private drive leading to the Adams estate, the massive wrought iron gates stood wide open. The guard shack was empty, a half-eaten meal still steaming on the desk. Peter felt a knot of dread tighten in his chest. They were too late, or someone had already breached the perimeter. The SUVs screeched to a halt in front of the neoclassical mansion, a house built on the profit of his pain. Peter was out of the car before it had fully stopped. He didn't head for the grand front entrance with its marble pillars and gold-leafed doors. He ran toward the side of the house, to the service ramp hidden behind a thick hedge of overgrown boxwood. This was the only door he knew, the door where his supplies were delivered, the door that had been his only view of the world for 3,650 days. The service door had been kicked in. The electronic keypad was smashed, wires sparking in the damp night air. Peter lunged inside, his heart hammering against his ribs. He bypassed the luxury of the upper floors, descending the narrow concrete stairs into the bowels of the building. The air grew colder, smelling of dust, mineral spirits, and the iron tang of old blood. He reached the basement level and stopped. The heavy steel door to his studio, his cell, was standing ajar. Inside, the room was a chaotic wreck. Racks of canvases had been overturned. Jars of expensive pigments were shattered across the floor, creating a grotesque rainbow of powdered minerals. But the safe, the heavy industrial-grade vault embedded in the far wall, was the focus of the carnage. A man in a tactical vest was kneeling in front of it, a thermal lance in his hand. The blue flame hissed as it ate through the reinforced steel. He wasn't alone. Standing over him was a woman Peter recognized from Bethany's inner circle, her business manager Marcus. "Faster!" Marcus barked, not noticing Peter in the doorway. "If we don't get the ledgers out before the feds arrive, we're all dead. Bethany's already burned, but these blueprints are worth $50 million on the black market in Dubai." "The blueprints aren't yours to sell," Peter said, his voice echoing in the hollow room like a ghost returning to haunt his own grave. Marcus spun around, a pistol clearing his holster in a blurred motion. But he wasn't fast enough. A red dot appeared on his chest, followed by a dozen more, as Serafina's elite tactical team flooded the room from the stairs behind Peter. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hiss of the dying thermal lance. Serafina Sheldon stepped into the wreckage of the studio, her heels crunching on the dried paint chips. She looked at the narrow cot in the corner, the single light bulb hanging from a frayed cord, and the bucket of gray water Peter had used to wash his brushes. Her face, usually a mask of regal indifference, twisted in a spasm of genuine fury. "You kept a master here," she whispered, her voice trembling with a lethal edge. "In this hole." She turned to her captain. "Take them. If they resist, don't waste the taxpayers' money on a trial." As the mercenaries were dragged out, Peter walked toward the safe. The door was glowing red from the heat of the lance, but it hadn't been breached yet. He didn't need a torch. He reached behind a loose brick in the wall, a secret he'd kept even from Bethany, and pulled out a small hand-cranked generator he'd built from spare parts. He plugged it into a hidden port in the vault's frame. "Bethany thought the safe was hers because she had the code," Peter said, his eyes focused on the mechanism. "But I'm the one who installed the secondary override. I told her it was a ventilation fan." With a series of heavy, mechanical clicks, the vault door swung open. Inside weren't just sketches, there were hundreds of ledgers, stacks of untraceable currency, and a single small canvas wrapped in silk. Peter reached for the canvas first. He unwrapped it carefully, his breath catching. It was a portrait of a woman, not Bethany, but a soft, glowing image of his mother, the last thing he had painted before his world went dark. Bethany had used it as collateral, a trophy to remind him that she owned even his memories. "She has a secret partner, Serafina," Peter said, pulling a leather-bound book from the safe. "Look at the names in this ledger. It wasn't just Bethany. She was funding a political campaign. She was buying the very judges who signed my commitment papers." Catherine Signalo leaned in, her eyes widening as she read the first name on the list. "The Chief Justice and the Minister of Culture." "Peter, you haven't just exposed a fraud. You've just decapitated the leadership of the capital." Peter looked around his prison one last time. He felt no nostalgia, only a cold, sharpening resolve. He took the ledger and handed it to Serafina. "The art world is a lie, Empress. But tomorrow we start painting the truth." The leather-bound ledger felt like a lead weight in Peter's hands, its cold surface a map of every soul Bethany had bought to keep him in the dark. As Serafina Sheldon flipped through the pages, her face became a mask of surgical, calculating fury. She saw the names of senators, the signatures of the very judges who had upheld Peter's instability rulings, and the bank account numbers of the critics who had praised Bethany's stolen genius while ignoring the ghost of Florence. "She didn't just steal your life, Peter," Serafina whispered, her thumb tracing the name of the Minister of Culture. "She built a fortress of corruption around you. This ledger is a nuclear bomb. If we release this tonight, the Capitol doesn't just change, it burns." Peter looked at his hands, still smelling of the turpentine and damp stone of his cell. He didn't want the Capitol to change, he wanted it to pay. "Then let it burn," Peter said, his voice sounding like gravel grinding on iron. "I want every man who took a check to sign my life away to find his name on the front page of every paper by dawn. No more shadows." Catherine Signillo pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she synchronized with the Sheldon Media mainframe. "I can have the digital editions updated in 20 minutes. We have the wire transfer records from the safe. We have the blueprints she was trying to sell. But Peter, we need a face for this. If it comes from the Sheldon family, they'll call it a corporate takeover. If it comes from me, they'll call it an art feud. It has to come from you." "The Empress's Gala isn't over yet," Peter said, his eyes hardening with a new, dangerous clarity. "The guests are still there, waiting for the prodigy to return. They're waiting for the next auction. Let's give them a show they'll never forget." 20 minutes later, the convoy screamed back into the heart of the city, tires screeching against the rain-slicked pavement. The Sheldon Grand Gallery was still glowing with golden light, but the atmosphere inside had turned into a den of whispers and paranoia. The elite were huddled in small groups, checking their phones as the first rumors of the blackout protocol and the police raid on the Adams estate began to leak. They looked up in a panicked surge as the heavy oak doors swung open for the second time that night. Peter Adams didn't enter through the service door this time. He walked down the center of the hall, flanked by Serafina Sheldon and Catherine Signillo. He wasn't wearing the frayed, oversized tuxedo anymore. He was dressed in a deep charcoal suit Serafina's staff had provided, a suit that made him look like a dark, vengeful king returning to a kingdom he had never truly lost. William Morgan, the Minister of Culture and the man who had personally signed the order to seize Peter's unstable early works, stood near the Morning Star painting. His face was a sweaty shade of gray, his hands trembling as he clutched a glass of whiskey. He tried to force a smile as Peter approached, but his eyes were darting toward the exits. "Peter, my boy." "We heard there was some confusion at the estate, a misunderstanding with Bethany's accounts. I'm sure we can settle this quietly. No need for a public spectacle." Peter didn't say a word. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the ledger. He didn't hand it to Morgan. He threw it onto the podium where the auctioneer had stood only an hour ago. The book hit the wood with a sound like a gavel striking a death sentence. "Page 42, William," Peter said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "That's the entry for the renovations of your private gallery. Curiously, it matches the exact amount Bethany received for the sale of my Midnight in Rome canvas, the one you personally authenticated as a Bethany Adams original, despite knowing I was the one who mixed the lead white in my basement while you watched." Morgan's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The room was so quiet you could hear the frantic beating of his heart. Peter turned to the rest of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the people who had stepped over his fingers while he knelt on the floor earlier that night. "I have spent 10 years being told that my voice didn't matter," Peter announced. "I was told that I was a ghost. Well, the ghost is done haunting. This ledger contains the price tag for every person in this room who helped Bethany Adams bury me alive. Serafina, call the Attorney General. Tell him the master is ready to testify." The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder with every passing second, a chorus of justice screaming through the streets. The elite began to scatter, but the Sheldon security detail blocked the exits with cold, unmoving precision. There was no van waiting in the loading dock this time. There were only handcuffs and the blinding, unforgiving light of the truth. The morning sun hit the Riverton Heights with a cold, unforgiving brilliance, but it didn't feel like the sun Peter remembered. It felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. While William Morgan and the other associates from the ledger were being processed in the city's central precinct, Peter stood in the grand foyer of the mansion Bethany had bought with his Midnight in Rome earnings. The house was quiet now, the frantic energy of the mercenaries replaced by the methodical movement of the Sheldon legal team. Bethany had been released on a massive bond, not because the Empress was merciful, but because Serafina wanted her to see the end. As the front door groaned open, Bethany stumbled in. Her red silk dress was wrinkled, her hair a chaotic nest of blonde strands, and her eyes were bloodshot. She stopped dead when she saw Peter standing at the top of the marble staircase. He was holding a single, small cardboard box. "Peter," she whispered, her voice a ragged shadow of its former authority. "You can't stay here. This is my house. My name is on the deed. I've called my lawyers. They said the blackout protocol is a violation of my civil rights. You're going to lose everything for this." Peter didn't look down at her. He looked at the portrait of his mother he had rescued from the basement. The deed was signed with a pen bought by a ghost, Bethany. And ghosts don't have civil rights. Neither do people whose entire net worth was built on a foundation of grand larceny. He walked down the stairs slowly, each step echoing like a drumbeat. The Sheldon conglomerate bought the mortgage from the bank 20 minutes ago. Then they sold it to me for $1. "You aren't in your house, Bethany. You're a trespasser in mine." "You're heartless," she shrieked, lunging toward him, but her knees buckled before she could reach the first step. She collapsed onto the marble she used to brag about. "I gave you 10 years. I fed you. I kept you alive when you were ready to give up." "You didn't keep me alive," Peter said, stopping just inches from her. "You kept me on life support, so you could harvest my soul. You didn't give me 10 years, you stole them. You stole the sound of the wind. You stole the taste of food that didn't come from a tray. You even stole the grief I was supposed to feel for my mother because you wouldn't let me attend her funeral." Bethany looked up, her face twisted in a desperate, ugly mask. "I did it for us. We were a team. The world loves Bethany Adams. If you destroy me, the art world dies with me." "The art world doesn't need a thief," Peter replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy iron key, the key to the basement studio. He dropped it onto the floor in front of her. "The Sheldon team has finished clearing the evidence. The safe is empty. The ledgers are with the FBI. But I left one thing down there for you. A gift. Something you can take with you when the police come back to finish the job." Bethany scrambled for the key, her fingers clawing at the marble. She ran toward the basement, stairs, her mind likely racing with thoughts of a hidden stash of cash or a secret painting she could sell to flee the country. Peter watched her go, his expression as cold as the stone walls she had kept him behind. She reached the basement and threw open the door. The studio was empty. No canvases, no pigments, no money. Just a single massive mirror she had installed years ago to check her outfits before her reveal parties, but Peter had painted over it. In the center of the mirror, in the permanent, impossible-to-scrub infinite blue pigment, he had painted a single word in the style of the old masters: forgery. Bethany stared at her reflection through the blue paint, seeing the fraud she had become. Behind her, the sound of heavy boots echoed on the stairs. Not the Sheldon guards this time. The federal marshals had arrived. Peter stood at the top of the stairs, silhouetted by the morning light. He didn't stay to watch the handcuffs click. He turned his back on the basement, walked out the front door, and let the sun hit his face for the very first time as a free man. The news didn't just break. It shattered the foundations of the global art market. By noon, the Bethany Adams brand was radioactive. Every museum from Paris to Tokyo had draped her canvases in black cloth, while insurance companies scrambled to distance themselves from a billion-dollar fraud. Peter stood in the center of the Sheldon conglomerate's private hangar, watching his crates, his life's work, were unloaded from armored trucks. These were the pieces seized from galleries across the country. They were coming home to the man who had breathed life into them. Serafina Sheldon stood beside him, her phone vibrating incessantly with calls from heads of state. She ignored them all. "The world is terrified, Peter. They are holding Bethany originals that are now worth less than the frames they sit in. They want a statement. They want to know if the master will authenticate the works they've already paid for." Peter walked to the nearest crate and pried it open with a crowbar. Inside was the Whispering Saint, a piece he had painted during a particularly brutal winter when the basement heater had failed. He remembered blowing on his fingers to keep them from freezing so he could finish the delicate lace on the saint's collar. He looked at the bottom corner where the bold Gold B. Adams signature sat like a parasite. "I won't authenticate anything with her name on it," Peter said, his voice flat and resolute. "As long as that signature remains, the art is a lie. If they want the value restored, they have to bring the canvases to me. I will strip her name from the history of art, one stroke at a time." Catherine Signillo stepped forward, holding a tablet displaying a live feed from the city's largest auction house. "The chaos is working in our favor, Peter. The Minister of Culture's replacement has already issued a decree. All works associated with the Adams fraud are being called in for remastering. But Bethany isn't going down quietly. Her legal team is arguing that since you were married, the art is community property. They're claiming that even. If you painted it, she directed the vision, making her a co-creator. Peter let out a short, dark laugh. She directed the vision? The only thing she directed was the locksmith who installed the bolts on my door. He turned to Serafina. I want to hold a public restoration, not in a private gallery, not for the billionaires. I want it in the city square, under the sun. I want everyone to see what happens when the truth is scrubbed clean. The purge of Riverton took place 3 days later. A massive stage was erected in the shadow of the Ministry of Culture. Thousands gathered, silent and expectant. Peter sat at a simple easel, surrounded by the masterpieces Bethany had claimed as her own. In his hand, he didn't hold a brush, but a scalpel and a specialized solvent he had formulated in his basement, a liquid designed to eat through top-layer signatures without harming the master glaze beneath. The first painting was brought out. It was a portrait of a merchant's daughter that had once sold for $12 million. Peter didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the cameras. He applied the solvent to the gold signature. As the liquid touched the paint, the name Bethany began to liquefy, dripping off the canvas like black blood. Underneath, the crowd gasped as a hidden, subtle texture was revealed. Peter hadn't used paint for his true signature. He had used a blind embossing technique that could only be seen once the superficial layers were gone. The letters P. Adams shimmered in the sunlight, etched into the very fibers of the cloth. One by one he stripped the lies away. He did it for 6 hours, his hands moving with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. With every name he erased, the crowd's roar grew louder. They weren't just watching art being restored. They were watching a man being resurrected. Far away, in a cold holding cell, Bethany watched the broadcast on a flickering monitor. She screamed, clawing at the bars as she watched her genius literally dissolve into a puddle on a stage. She was witnessing the ultimate revenge. Peter wasn't just taking the money, he was taking the glory, leaving her name to be forgotten by the very world that had once worshipped her. By the time the sun set, the name Bethany Adams didn't exist in the world of art. There was only the master, and for the first time in 10 years he was no longer a prisoner of the void. The courtroom was a tomb of cold marble and high-backed oak, but the air was charged with the electricity of a dying empire. Bethany sat at the defense table, her designer clothes replaced by a drab, institutional gray suit that drained the last of the artificial glamour from her face. Her lead attorney, a man known for saving the most hated villains in the capital, stood with a predatory smile. He wasn't fighting for her innocence anymore. He was fighting for her cut of the blood money. Your Honor, the attorney began, his voice smooth as oil. The marriage between my client and Peter Adams was a legal partnership. Under the statutes of this state, all creative output during the union is considered joint intellectual property. While Mr. Adams may have provided the labor, Mrs. Adams provided the brand, the marketing, and the strategic direction. To strip her of her half of the billion-dollar Adams estate is not justice. It is a violation of the sanctity of marriage. Bethany looked over at Peter, a spark of the old manipulative fire in her eyes. She leaned toward him, whispering just loud enough for the front row to hear. I still win, Peter. Even if you hate me, you'll spend the rest of your life working to pay for my freedom. Every brushstroke you make for the rest of your life, I get half. We're tied together forever. Peter didn't flinch. He sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Catherine Signalo and a team of Sheldon's most lethal forensic accountants. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like a man who had already moved past the person sitting across from him. He stood up slowly, holding a single, ancient-looking document encased in a protective plastic sleeve. The marriage was a contract, Your Honor, Peter said, his voice steady and echoing. And like any contract, it is predicated on the capacity and consent of the parties involved. For 10 years, Bethany Adams used her position as my guardian to declare me mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. She used those medical records, the ones we have now proven were forged through bribery, to keep me in a state of legal infancy. He placed the document on the judge's bench. This is the original marriage certificate, and this, he signaled to Catherine, who opened a laptop to show a video feed, is the security footage from the basement of the Adams estate. It shows Bethany forcing me to sign blank power of attorney documents while I was under the influence of the medication she was illicitly administering. Peter's eyes locked onto Bethany's. You can't claim the benefits of a marriage you used as a prison. Under the Slayer's rule of civil law, a person cannot profit from a crime they committed against the very estate they are claiming. You didn't just fraud the public, Bethany. You kidnapped your husband. You committed human trafficking within your own home. The judge leaned forward, his face a mask of grim realization. He looked at the evidence, then at the shivering woman at the defense table. The court finds that the marriage between Peter Adams and Bethany Adams was not a partnership but a prolonged criminal act. By the power vested in me, I hereby annul the marriage ab initio, as if it never existed. All assets, past and present, are restored to the sole ownership of Peter Adams." The gavel struck the wood like a thunderclap. Bethany let out a primal scream of rage, lunging across the table toward Peter, her nails aiming for his eyes. "I made you. You were nothing without me. You were just a freak in a basement." The bailiffs tackled her before she could touch him, pinning her to the floor. As she was dragged out of the courtroom, kicking and screaming, Peter didn't even turn his head. He looked at Catherine and Serafina, who were waiting at the back of the room. The chains weren't just broken, they had been vaporized. The Grand Hall of the capital's National Museum was packed with a crowd that had waited through the night to witness the impossible. The masterpiece of the century was covered by a massive veil of white silk, standing where Bethany's stolen works once hung. But this wasn't an auction. There were no price tags, no velvet ropes, and no billionaires bidding for status. Peter had ensured that the front rows were filled with the students of the academy, the ones Bethany would have stepped over on her way to a gala. Serafina Sheldon stood at the podium, her voice vibrating with a rare warmth. For a decade we looked at beauty through a lens of deception. We worshipped the frame and ignored the soul. Tonight, we don't just unveil a painting, we unveil the truth of a man who survived the dark to bring us the light. She turned and nodded to Peter, who stood at the edge of the stage. Peter walked toward the veil. He looked different. His hands were still stained, but his shoulders were square and his eyes held the clarity of a man who no longer had to hide his thoughts. He reached for the cord, but he stopped for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces. He saw Catherine Signalo, who had risked her family's legacy to find his hidden signature. He saw the empty space where Bethany would have been, a silent reminder of the cage he had escaped. With a single fluid motion, Peter pulled the cord. The silk fell away, and for a full 30 seconds the room was so silent you could hear the heartbeat of the crowd. It wasn't a landscape, it wasn't a religious icon or a merchant's daughter. It was a massive, sprawling canvas of a city street at dawn, painted in colors that seemed to vibrate with their own internal energy. In the center of the street stood a man, not a god or a master, but a simple artist, his face turned toward a sun that was just beginning to break over the horizon. But the secret was in the technique. As the gallery lights shifted to simulate the rising sun, the painting began to change because of the way Peter had layered the pigments, the void brush style he had perfected in total darkness. The shadows on the canvas moved. The man in the painting seemed to step out of the darkness and into the light in real time. It was a living bridge between his 10 years of captivity and his first day of freedom. "It's called the first breath," Peter said, his voice quiet but reaching every ear in the hall. "I didn't paint it for a gallery. I didn't paint it for a signature. I painted it to prove that you can bury a man, but you cannot bury the light he carries inside him. This painting will never be sold. It belongs to the city, to be kept in this hall as a reminder that the truth is the only masterpiece that matters." The applause didn't start with a roar. It started with a single person standing, then another, until the entire hall was a standing ovation that lasted for 10 minutes. Catherine walked up to the stage, tears glinting in her eyes. "You did it, Peter. You're not the ghost of Florence anymore. You're the master of the capital." Peter looked at the painting, then at the open doors of the museum where the real sun was setting over the city. He felt the weight of the last 10 years finally lift, evaporating like mist on a summer morning.